I wish I'd installed a vise when I built this workbench, but I didn't do that, so now I'm going to retrofit it. Retrofitting, I think, will be a lot harder than it would have been if I'd put the vise in the first place. Here's the vise I'm going to use. It's an inexpensive Pony brand vise. I think it runs about $60. I want that rear jaw to be flush with my workbench, and I'm going to use my Shaper Origin CNC router to route the very deep mortise that I'll need for that. My starting point for that digital file was a flatbed scan. I just took the rear vise jaw and scanned it on a flatbed, then loaded that picture onto my design software. I use something called Affinity Designer, and I can trace around that picture with the pen tool. Now what I did on this is I know I'm going to have a router bit that will have to go out beyond the edge of the mortise in order to have a clean entry and exit into the mortise. So I added an extra 1/4 inch at the bottom of it. You'll see this at the end. The upper line is where the vise jaw actually would end, and then the lower line's a 1/4 inch beyond that. Here I'm just taking a quick measurement to make sure it's going to not interfere with those legs. The vise is on the bottom of the workbench, and it's fine. And right now what I'm doing is measuring from the center of the vise to the edge of the workbench, because I'm going to use the Shaper Origin to place that vise in exactly the spot I want, which is 8 1/4 inches from the edge of the workbench. The prior shot in this one shows this black and white tape that's down on the workbench surface. That's shaper tape, so it's got little dots that allow the shaper to orient itself. And here I'm scanning that shaper tape so that shaper will know, where it is in relation to where that tape is stuck down on the workbench. The next thing I'm going to do is use the Shaper Origin to make what they call a grid. The grid's going to basically make a couple of layout lines, an X and Y axis. The gridding uses the actual bit in the tool. You lower it down. Here I'm about to lean down, and it looks really awkward to sort of see if the bit's down deep enough to make that grid. So I've got to lean down and actually look and make sure it's low enough, because I'm going to be tapping the side of the bit on the edge of the workbench, both the workbench top and the workbench side, to make that XY axis where I can place the digital file to make that mortise. Here I'm just tapping against the top of the workbench. I press the button on the shaper to tell it that's one spot. I go over here and gently tap on this far edge of the top of the workbench, and then go around the corner and tap the bit the third time, and that's what tells it where these axes meet at a 90-degree angle. The gridding will make more sense when you see me drop the digital file for the mortise in there. Here I'm selecting the file. I've got it loaded on there. Then what I'm going to do is tell it which anchor point I want. I want the center anchor point, because that's where I measured 8 1/4 inches over. And it's on. So here I'm going to tell it I want it 8.25 inches. And then I know that I want, a 1/4 inch from the bottom. I explained that before. I want room for the router bit to be able to exit. But I put it a 1/4 inch on the wrong side. It's a 1/4 inch above the line. It needs to be a 1/4 inch below the line. So I'm just going to go in there and tell it negative 1/4 inch, not positive 1/4 inch. That moves it down into just the right spot. Then I hit the button that says place, and it puts the file right in that spot. I'm going to be cutting with an 8mm bit. That's a pretty big bit. I'm going to cut a 1/4 inch deep. I'm leaving myself 5/100ths of an inch inside the line. You can do that by specifying an offset. Here it's a positive offset of 5/100ths, so that means it's 5/100ths away from that digital line I made for the mortise. Once I get the mortise down to the final depth, which is going to be 1.5 inches, it's going to be very deep, then I'll move up to the line and maybe even over the line a bit, because I'll just test fit the vise as I do that. Here I'm doing the first cut. This is in real time at this point. I'll speed it up a bit later. And I'm just going right up to a spot. I'm going to stop here just so I can readjust the camera. So I'm raising out of the cut. I'm going to zoom out of the camera so I don't go out of camera range. And then I can just go down and, where I stop cutting, I can just tell it, okay, I just want to resume right there again. Drop it down and keep going on the cut. Upcoming here, you're going to see a spot where it jumps, where I made a mistake and glitched and got outside the line right there. And it retracts the bit right away, which keeps it from, causing much damage, especially if you have that offset. I've got the 5/100ths offset, so I could gouge it a little bit and not really hurt the work. This is continuing in real time, just sort of slowly going around there. You can see I'm, going pretty slowly on each pass. And it took a fair amount of force. That 8mm bit has taken quite a lot of wood out of there. So I couldn't go very fast, but you can see I go right around the corners, and as long as I stay reasonably consistent, it just follows the line perfectly. And here I've speeded it up just so, it's going to take forever. But you can see I'm going over, I'm starting a new pass. Next one's going to be 1/2 inch deep. So I'm cutting, another 1/4 inch out of there. And I just go round and round and do that until I've got the entire 1.5 inch depth. Then I have to go back and route out the part in the middle, the pocket cut in the middle. And I'm just not going to show any of that. So here's what I ended up with. I've got this 1.5 inch mortise. It's sized just right. But it's not deep enough for the back of the, the bottom part of the face of the vise jaw. That's got to go down about another 2 inches. You'll see me here measure it in a second. It's like about 2 1/8 inches that has to go even deeper. I can't do that with the shaper origin. It's just, it won't let me route that deep. So I'm going to be using, a multi-tool and some chisels to get out the rest of that wood for the rest of the mortise. This is when I discover how dull the blade was on my multi-tool. It just immediately starts to smoke when I'm barely even touching the wood. I switched over and used another blade for a while. I mean, this ultimately was, I think, a good tool choice. It was just a terrible old blade. So I'm making all this smoke as I try to, cut away so I can eventually mortise deeper. Here I finally tried a different blade. It works a little bit better. It was still kind of a fight, but I think the multi-tool actually helped with this part of it. Later on, I just switched to chisels and just hacked away at it. It didn't have to be, super clean. It's just going to be, the bottom of the workbench where the vise has to have enough wood to attach to, but if the wood's a little ragged down there, it really doesn't matter much. There's still a lot of, kind of ugly pounding and levering and chiseling to get that out of there. And it ends up looking kind of ugly. You'll see it in a second. At least the part that won't show, is pretty grisly. But, the part that the shaper origin did, which is the part you're going to be able to see, and the part that really matters for the fit, it ended up fitting just fine. Thank you very much. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. How do you like me now? Really nice fit. The wooden face for the rear jaw is a piece of maple. I've got to go plane it down a little bit to have it fit. So I'm just going to go run it through the planer real quick. I've cut it down to size. It's a little bit thicker than it needs to be, but that's fine because I'm going to adjust that later. In order to hold that in. It actually holds in with M6, metric 6 bolts, which kind of surprises me, but that's what that rear face is threaded for. So I'm gonna just mark a piece of paper where those M6 bolt holes are, and then I will countersink and through hole for the rear face, so it can get bolted on there without the bolts poking out into the jaw face. I'm just transferring the holes I made in the paper to the front or the rear jaw face. I use the holes I made with the punch to use a Forstner bit. My Forstner bit's ridiculously dull. This is speeded up, and it just takes me forever with this ridiculously dull Forstner bit to drill that hard maple. Anyways, I got to drill it down enough so that the socket head, the cap head, doesn't stick out. I need to make sure it's going to be below the surface of that face, and then I do the same on the other side. The Forstner bit leaves a nice little dimple for the through hole, so it's easy to place those. Here, since it's an M6, I'm just using a 6mm drill bit and kind of wiggle it around a little bit to give myself a little extra wiggle room for mounting. And the mounting, here's a test mount, it goes fine. When I did my test fit, I noticed I needed to probably leave a little room, just create some relief for the rods that will hold the front jaw. So I marked those and then transferred the thing over to my existing vise and used a half round file just to file a little bit of relief in those. You'll see it in an upcoming clip in a second. It's kind of unfortunate, but the mounting holes for the rear jaw fall right on this gap in a couple of layers of wood on the workbench, but I'm going to epoxy those in. Another unfortunate thing is that I wanted to use 1/4" hex head bolts, which themselves fit fine, but my socket won't fit down, and I've got no way to turn them all the way in. So I had to go to an alternative. I used some number 14 sheet metal screws. I think I used 2-inch sheet metal screws. Those are the most robust thing I could find that actually fit in there. At this point, I'm just driving them in, and there's plenty of bite. You can tell by the way the impact driver reacts. And then I'm going to pull them back out, because when I finally mount them, I'm going to put a bunch of epoxy down there into the holes I've kind of pre-made by driving those in and then pulling them back out. Here I'm just mixing up some 5-minute epoxy. When I put it in, I use a little syringe system. I'll put a link in the description. So once I get it all mixed up, I'll put a little top on a syringe, and the syringe is a nice way to squirt things into small openings. You'll see when I use the syringe, you've got to pull the plunger all the way to the top of the syringe to create enough vacuum for that kind of thick. Here I'm going to put the top on it, and that's got the little needle that'll pull up the epoxy. Anyways, I've got to pull the plunger all the way up to create enough vacuum to slowly let that epoxy ooze in there. Some air gets in too, at least it did this time. But once it's had a couple minutes, and this is in real time, 30 seconds or something for the epoxy to ooze in there, it comes back and you get a decent amount of epoxy in it. First the air will squirt out, then the epoxy will all squirt down in that hole. And what I'll do then is put some more epoxy on the end of the screw that in. That'll be nice and tight with lots of epoxy all around. And then I'll just do the same thing on the other side. I'm just going to show the first screw. I guess you've kind of seen this before. This is the bottom where those extra screws are going to go in there. I use 5/16 lag screws on that. There's no problem reaching in there. I put some washers on them so it would hold them on there nicely. I used epoxy on those too. Here I'm putting in the rear jaw face for the final time, just getting it screwed down there. And as you'll see in a bit, it is not quite flush. It's a little proud of the surface. So I planed it down. I tried to use my number 7 plane first. That's my big long jointer plane, thinking that would make sense. I just couldn't get a bite on it. I barely could get anything off with the jointer plane. So I switched to a smaller number 5 plane here in a second, and the number 5 plane, worked quite well to get those shavings off of there and get it down to a nice surface. Here comes the 5 plane right now. After I gave up on the number 7, the 5, did quite well with it. And I end up with a pretty flush surface. I mean, you can tell the whole workbench itself is not exactly a work of art. It's a pretty crude workbench, but this is getting it pretty flush. And there it is, nice and flush. For the front jaw face, the wood on that face, it's easier because it's just got 4 holes, and you just use screws from the front of the vise itself. So all I'm doing here is taking that wood that I've made for that front face, clamping it in exactly where I want it. Then I go and pre-drill those holes. I don't show the pre-drilling. I'm going to just put them in with screws. I like to use a little wax. It doesn't matter what kind of wax you use. That happens to be min wax, but any kind of paste wax will work. Just a tiny dab makes the screws a lot easier to drive in. So, it's easy to drive those in just with a hand screwdriver. No impact driver needed on that. And once I get that in, that's it. The vise is done. I just have to flip the workbench upright again, take the shaper tape off, and thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button. I invite you to subscribe if you want to see more of these. I'm trying to put out one of these a week with my little workshop improvements. There's the vise in place. Here it is in action, just doing a little hand planing just for the fun of it, just to show that it holds it, grips it quite nicely, and it's nice to have a vise on that workbench. So again, thanks for watching. I hope to see you back for future videos.